The words, "I've been alone for 15 years, fell from the mountain man's scarred lips as he extended his massive hand toward Eleanor Hayes, a gesture that would shatter her carefully ordered life as the town's respected schoolteacher. Standing before his towering frame while townspeople watched in horrified silence, Eleanor made a choice that would mark her forever as either foolishly reckless or extraordinarily brave. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The September sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Willow Creek as Miss Eleanor Hayes made her way toward the schoolhouse. At 32, she had long since made peace with the life she had chosen, or perhaps the life that had chosen her. 8 years of teaching in this remote mountain town had earned her the respect of its residents, if not their complete understanding. A woman of her age, unmarried and independent, was something of an oddity on the frontier. The hem of her blue cotton dress brushed against the weathered boards of the walkway as she navigated around a pair of children racing toward the general store. She adjusted her grip on the stack of readers she carried, the weight familiar after years of walking this same path. The mountains loomed in the distance, vast and indifferent to the small human dramas unfolding beneath them. "Good morning, Miss Hayes," called Mrs. Peterson from the doorway of her boarding house. "Will you be joining us for supper tonight? I've made apple cobbler." Eleanor smiled and shook her head. "Thank you kindly, but I've lessons to prepare, perhaps another time." The routine exchange was comforting in its predictability. Another invitation, another polite refusal. The town had long ago stopped expecting her to conform to their notions of how a woman should live. She was their teacher, existing in a category all her own. The schoolhouse bell tower came into view, and Eleanor quickened her pace. She liked to arrive early to savor the quiet moments before the children filled the room with their energy and questions. Her classroom was her domain, the one place where she felt entirely certain of her purpose. She had nearly reached the schoolhouse steps when the commotion began. Raised voices came from the direction of Sheriff Taylor's office. Eleanor hesitated, torn between curiosity and her usual habit of avoiding the town's disturbances. Then she heard a sound that sent a chill through her despite the warm morning, a deep guttural growl that seemed barely human. "Keep that animal chained," someone shouted. "He's liable to kill someone." Against her better judgment, Eleanor turned toward the noise. A small crowd had gathered in front of the sheriff's office. Through the gaps between onlookers, she caught glimpses of a man. No, something more like a force of nature than a man, struggling against the grip of 3 deputies. He was enormous, standing at least 6.5 feet tall, with shoulders broad enough to fill a doorway. His chest was bare save for a tattered vest that hung open, revealing skin weathered by sun and wind and marked with jagged scars. A wild mane of dark hair fell past his shoulders, matched by a beard that reached to his chest. But it was his eyes that struck Eleanor most forcefully, pale blue and filled with such primal fury that she found herself taking an involuntary step backward. "That's him, ain't it?" whispered a voice beside her. Eleanor turned to find young Tom Peterson, his eyes wide with excitement. "That's the mountain man they've been talking about, the one who's been living up in the high country all alone for years." "I wouldn't know," Eleanor replied, trying to infuse her voice with disapproval, though she couldn't tear her gaze away from the spectacle. "And you should be heading to school, not gawking at—" Her words died in her throat as the wild man threw off 2 of the deputies with a roar that seemed to shake the very boardwalk beneath her feet. The 3rd deputy went flying into the water trough with a splash. For a moment, the mountain man stood free, his massive chest heaving, his gaze darting around like a cornered animal seeking escape. Then his eyes locked with Eleanor's. Something passed between them in that moment. A recognition, perhaps, though of what she couldn't have said. The fury in his eyes didn't diminish, but it was joined by something else: confusion, curiosity. For 3 heartbeats, neither of them moved. Sheriff Taylor broke the spell, approaching cautiously with his pistol drawn. "Now, see here, Wyatt," he said, using a tone one might employ with a skittish horse. "Nobody's looking to hurt you. We just need to sort out what happened with Hargrove's cattle." The man, Wyatt, didn't look away from Eleanor as he spoke, his voice a rumble like distant thunder. "Didn't take nothing that wasn't already dead." The crowd murmured. Eleanor realized she was still clutching her books to her chest like a shield. Slowly, deliberately, she lowered them to her side. Something about this wild creature demanded honesty, even in the smallest gestures. "Miss Hayes," the sheriff called, noticing her presence. "You might want to get on to the schoolhouse. This isn't a matter for a lady." Eleanor bristled at being dismissed, a familiar reaction after years of being underestimated by men who thought they knew better than she did what was and wasn't her concern. Before she could respond, however, the mountain man spoke again. "Hayes," he repeated, the name sounding strange and almost reverent on his lips. "Teacher." It wasn't a question, but Eleanor found herself nodding anyway. "Yes, I'm the teacher here." A hush fell over the crowd. The mountain man took a step toward her, and someone in the crowd gasped. Sheriff Taylor raised his pistol higher. "That's far enough, Wyatt." But the wild man ignored him, his gaze still fixed on Eleanor. "I've been alone for 15 years, he said, his voice softer now, meant only for her despite the crowd of listeners. "Up there." He gestured vaguely toward the mountains with one massive hand. Then, to the astonishment of everyone present, including Eleanor herself, he extended his hand toward her, not in threat, but in a gesture so vulnerable and human that it made her throat tighten. His palm was calloused and scarred, a map of solitary survival. 15 years, he repeated, and there was a question in his eyes that Eleanor couldn't fully comprehend, but which nevertheless resonated somewhere deep inside her. The crowd seemed to be holding its collective breath. Sheriff Taylor looked utterly bewildered. Eleanor knew what everyone expected, for her to shrink back, to turn away, to seek protection from this untamed creature who had emerged from the wilderness trailing legends and fear. Instead, she found herself stepping forward, drawn by something she couldn't name. Perhaps it was the teacher in her, always seeking to understand what others had dismissed. Perhaps it was the woman in her, recognizing a soul as solitary as her own. "My name is Eleanor Hayes," she said clearly, aware of every eye upon them. "And I don't believe we've been properly introduced, Mr. Wyatt." His eyes widened slightly, as if her ordinary courtesy was the most extraordinary thing he had encountered in 15 years of solitude. Slowly, with infinite care, Eleanor reached out and placed her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers, engulfing her hand completely, yet with a gentleness that belied his fearsome appearance. A murmur ran through the crowd, but Eleanor barely heard it. In that moment, with her small hand held in his massive one, she felt the first tremors of a shift in the foundations of her carefully ordered world. "Caleb," he said roughly, "not Wyatt. Caleb Wyatt." And with that simple exchange, her name for his, something began that would forever alter the story of Willow Creek, the mountain man, and the teacher who, despite all expectations, including her own, took his hand. The crowd's murmuring grew louder as Eleanor's hand remained in Caleb's grasp. Sheriff Taylor cleared his throat pointedly, his pistol still raised. "Miss Hayes, I must insist you step back," he said, tension evident in his voice. "This man is dangerous." Eleanor felt a nearly imperceptible tightening of Caleb's fingers around hers, not threatening, but something more like apprehension. She looked up at his weathered face and saw a flash of resignation in those pale blue eyes, as if he was accustomed to being feared, to being treated as something less than human. "Is he under arrest, Sheriff?" she asked, not releasing Caleb's hand. Taylor shifted uncomfortably. Not precisely. There's been complaints about him taking cattle, but I told you, Caleb interrupted, his deep voice rumbling. Found it dead in the ravine. Took only what the mountain cats would have taken anyway. Eleanor turned back to the sheriff. Then he's committed no crime you can prove. That ain't the point, Miss Hayes, said Jacob Hargrove, stepping forward from the crowd. The cattle rancher's face was flushed with anger. That savage has been lurking in the hills for years, watching our homes, our women. God knows what else he's stolen or done. Caleb's body tensed beside her, but he remained silent, his eyes now fixed on a point in the distance, as if he had retreated somewhere far from the hostility surrounding him. Eleanor felt a surge of indignation. Mr. Hargrove, in the 8 years I've taught in Willow Creek, I've yet to hear a single credible account of Mr. Wyatt harming anyone. Meanwhile, your boy Timothy tells quite colorful tales of shooting at, and I quote, the wild man for sport. Hargrove's face darkened further, but before he could respond, Eleanor turned to Sheriff Taylor. If you're not arresting him, then Mr. Wyatt is free to go, is he not? The sheriff holstered his pistol with clear reluctance. Technically speaking, yes, but then I see no reason for this spectacle to continue. Eleanor turned to Caleb, lowering her voice. Mr. Wyatt, do you require medical attention? Deputy Brooks seemed quite forceful. Something that might have been surprise flickered across his face. He shook his head slightly. Very well. Eleanor gently withdrew her hand from his and straightened her shoulders, addressing the sheriff again. I believe this matter is concluded. If you'll excuse me, I have a classroom to prepare. With that, she turned and walked toward the schoolhouse, feeling the weight of every eye upon her. She half expected to hear the commotion resume behind her. Perhaps Caleb would be seized again or worse. But there was only the shuffle of reluctantly dispersing townsfolk and a few disgruntled mutterings. She had nearly reached the schoolhouse steps when she heard the heavy footfalls behind her. Eleanor turned to find Caleb Wyatt following at a respectful distance, his massive frame somehow diminished in the morning light, as if he was trying to make himself smaller, less threatening. Mr. Wyatt, she acknowledged, uncertain of his intentions. He stopped several paces away. Need to thank you, he said, the words coming with apparent difficulty. Been a long time since anyone... He trailed off, seeming to search for words that had grown rusty from disuse. Stood up for you, Eleanor supplied, a barely perceptible nod. Been a long time since anyone saw me as a man. The simple truth of his statement caught Eleanor off guard. She had acted on instinct, offended by the town's treatment of him, but hadn't fully considered what her intervention might mean to someone who had been living on the margins of humanity for so long. That was uncivilized of them, she said finally, but people fear what they don't understand. And you're not afraid? There was genuine curiosity in his question. Eleanor considered him honestly. Despite his fearsome appearance, the wild hair, the scars, the sheer physical power evident in every movement, she found she wasn't afraid. Cautious perhaps, but not fearful. I've found that children who act the most threatening are often the ones most in need of kindness, she said. I suspect the same is true of men. A sound escaped him that might have been a laugh, rusty and unpracticed. Not a child. No, she agreed, her eyes taking in the breadth of his shoulders, the strength evident in his scarred hands. Clearly not. The first bell rang, signaling 30 minutes until school began. Soon children would be arriving, and Eleanor knew what they would see. Their teacher conversing with the legendary mountain man, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. The thought almost made her smile. I should prepare for my students, she said. Caleb nodded and took a step back, but didn't turn to leave. He seemed to be wrestling with something. You have books, he said finally, gesturing to the readers still clutched in her arms. Yes, McGuffey's readers for my older students. His eyes lingered on the books with an intensity that puzzled her. Then, with evident difficulty, he asked, "Could you teach someone who wasn't a child?" The question hung in the air between them, its significance far greater than the simple words might suggest. Eleanor realized what he was really asking, not just about reading, but about rejoining the world of men after 15 years in the wilderness. "I believe anyone can learn who truly wishes to," she replied carefully. "Though I wonder why a man who has chosen solitude would want to." His gaze lifted from the books to her face. "Didn't always choose it." The words were few, but they opened a chasm of possibilities in Eleanor's mind. What circumstances had driven this man to 15 years of isolation? What history lay behind those weather-beaten features and wary eyes? Before she could respond, a small voice called out, "Miss Hayes!" Young Sally Jenkins was approaching, her slate clutched in one hand, her eyes growing wide as saucers as she noticed who was standing with her teacher. Caleb immediately stiffened and began backing away. "I'll go." "Mr. Wyatt," Eleanor called after him, making a swift decision. "If you're sincere about learning, come to the schoolhouse after sunset. The children will be gone by then." He paused, regarding her with an expression of such raw hope that Eleanor felt something twist in her chest. Then he gave a single sharp nod before turning and striding away, his long legs carrying him swiftly toward the edge of town where the wilderness began. Sally reached Eleanor's side, her mouth hanging open. "Miss Hayes," she whispered, though Caleb was already too far to hear. Was that really him? The mountain man? Eleanor watched Caleb's retreating figure, wondering if he would actually return that evening, wondering what she would do if he did. "Yes, Sally," she said finally. "That was Mr. Wyatt, and like all of us, he has a great deal to learn." As the schoolyard began to fill with children, Eleanor turned toward her classroom, but her thoughts remained with the solitary figure now disappearing into the tree line. For 15 years, by his own admission, Caleb Wyatt had lived apart from human society, a creature of the mountains rather than the town. What forces had shaped him? What pain had driven him to such extreme isolation? And why, after all this time, was he reaching out now? The questions followed Eleanor into the schoolhouse, lingering even as she called her students to order and began the day's lessons. Outside, beyond the settled boundaries of Willow Creek, the mountains stood silent and ancient, keeping their secrets, and Caleb Wyatt's close. The schoolhouse stood quiet in the gathering dusk. Eleanor had dismissed her students hours ago, yet she remained at her desk, a single lamp burning beside her as she pretended to grade arithmetic exercises. In truth, her mind had been elsewhere all day, her thoughts returning again and again to Caleb Wyatt's unexpected request and her even more unexpected offer. She glanced at the small clock on her desk. Nearly 8. Perhaps he wouldn't come after all. The thought brought a confusing mixture of relief and disappointment. Eleanor rose and moved to the window, gazing out at the darkening landscape. The mountains were shadowy silhouettes against the indigo sky, mysterious and forbidding. Somewhere up there, Caleb Wyatt had made his home, separate from the comforts and constraints of civilization. What kind of life had he carved out for himself? And what had driven him to it? A movement at the edge of the tree line caught her eye. A tall figure emerged from the shadows, pausing as if uncertain, then began walking toward the schoolhouse with deliberate steps. Even at this distance, there was no mistaking Caleb's imposing form. Eleanor stepped back from the window, smoothing her skirts with suddenly nervous hands. She had changed after school into a simpler dress, dark blue wool rather than the more formal attire she wore for teaching. Now she wondered if that had been appropriate. Would he think she had dressed for him specifically? "This is merely a reading lesson," she reminded herself aloud. "Nothing more." A soft knock came at the door, so gentle it seemed impossible that it could have been produced by those massive hands she had observed that morning. Eleanor took a steadying breath and went to answer it. Caleb Wyatt filled the doorway, his broad shoulders nearly touching both sides of the frame. He had made some effort to tame his appearance. His wild mane of hair was tied back, and he wore a faded but clean flannel shirt buttoned to the throat. In his arms, he awkwardly cradled a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. "Mr. Wyatt," Eleanor greeted him, stepping aside. "Please come in." He ducked to enter, his eyes taking in the classroom, the rows of desks, the maps on the walls, the blackboard with its half-erased spelling words. He moved cautiously, as if afraid he might break something with an errant motion. "Wasn't sure you'd be here," he said, his voice low and rough-edged. "I said I would be." Eleanor closed the door and moved toward her desk. "And I keep my promises." Caleb nodded, still standing in the middle of the room, clearly uncomfortable in the confined space. The bundle in his arms shifted, and Eleanor realized with a start that it was moving. "I brought something," he said, noticing her gaze. Carefully, he unwrapped the oilcloth to reveal a young fox kit, its red fur matted on one side with what appeared to be dried blood. "Found her near a trapline," he explained. "Mother was dead. She's too young to survive alone." His large fingers gently stroked the kit's head. "Thought maybe you'd know what to feed her. Got milk up at my cabin, but she won't take it." Eleanor approached slowly, surprised by this unexpected revelation of tenderness from the fearsome mountain man. The fox kit regarded her with bright, wary eyes. "You've been caring for her?" Caleb nodded. 3 days now. She was weaker yesterday." Eleanor reached out hesitantly, and when Caleb didn't pull away, she stroked the kit's soft fur. "Try mixing the milk with a little honey," she suggested, "and use a cloth for her to suckle. My father raised orphaned lambs that way when I was a girl." Something that might have been gratitude flickered across Caleb's face. He rewrapped the kit carefully and set the bundle on a nearby chair, where it curled into a small ball. An awkward silence fell between them. Eleanor gestured to the largest desk in the front row. "Please sit, though I'm afraid it might be a bit small for you." Caleb regarded the desk dubiously, but folded his large frame into it with surprising grace. His knees jutted up at sharp angles, making him look like an adult playing at being a child. The absurdity of it almost made Eleanor smile, but she restrained herself, sensing that he would misinterpret her amusement as mockery. "Before we begin," she said, taking the chair beside his desk rather than remaining at her teacher's position, "may I ask what level of reading you already possess? Were you educated as a child?" Caleb's gaze dropped to his hands, which were clasped on the desktop. "Was. My mother taught me until I was 12. Then she died, and my father—" He trailed off, then continued more quietly. "Didn't see the use in it. Took me out of school to work the farm." "And you can still read some?" He nodded. Simple words. "Been so long, most letters look like strange marks now." A note of shame crept into his voice. "Forgotten more than I remember." Eleanor felt a surge of compassion. Education had been her salvation, her path to independence. To have had that opportunity and then lost it seemed especially cruel. "Well then," she said briskly, "we'll simply need to remind you. The mind is like a path through the forest. Without use, it becomes overgrown, but it's never truly gone." She rose and went to her desk, selecting a primer she used with her beginning students. When she returned, Caleb was watching her with an intensity that made her cheeks warm. "We'll start with the alphabet," she said, opening the book between them. "Each letter makes a specific sound, though some make several depending on their position in a word." As she began pointing out letters, Caleb leaned closer to see the page. Eleanor became acutely aware of his presence, the faint scent of wood smoke that clung to him, The controlled power in his movements, the surprising gentleness of his weathered hands as he carefully turned a page. Recognition dawned in his eyes as they worked. "I remember this one," he said, pointing to the letter W. "Like my name, Wyatt." "Yes, exactly," Eleanor encouraged him. "And this one?" She pointed to the letter H. He frowned in concentration. "Makes the sound at the start of house." "That's right." They continued through the alphabet, Caleb's recall improving with each letter. He was a quick study, his initial hesitation giving way to an eager curiosity that reminded Eleanor of her most promising students. By the time they moved on to simple words, he was fully absorbed in the lesson, his earlier self-consciousness forgotten. "You're progressing remarkably well," she told him as he successfully read a full sentence from the primer. Caleb looked up and Eleanor was struck by the transformation in his face. The wariness had receded, replaced by something that might almost be described as joy. It made him look younger, less forbidding, a glimpse perhaps of the boy he had been before solitude and hardship had carved their marks upon him. "Had a good teacher," he said simply. The compliment, delivered without artifice, affected Eleanor more than flowery praise from other men ever had. She felt her cheeks warm again and busied herself with turning to the next page. The sudden sharp rap on the schoolhouse door startled them both. Caleb was on his feet instantly, moving with surprising speed for a man of his size, positioning himself between Eleanor and the door. "Miss Hayes," Sheriff Taylor's voice called from outside. "Are you in there? Saw the light burning late?" Eleanor stood, smoothing her skirts. "Just a moment, Sheriff." She looked up at Caleb, who had tensed like a cornered animal. "It's all right," she said softly. "You've done nothing wrong." The doubt in his eyes spoke volumes about his past experiences with law enforcement. Eleanor moved toward the door but paused beside him. "Trust me," she whispered. And after a moment's hesitation, he gave a tight nod and stepped aside. Eleanor opened the door to find Sheriff Taylor on the steps, his hand resting casually near his holster. His eyes widened as he took in the scene. Eleanor standing in the doorway, Caleb Wyatt's massive form visible behind her, the intimate atmosphere of the lamp-lit classroom. "Evening, Sheriff," Eleanor said with deliberate calm. "Is there something I can help you with?" Taylor's gaze shifted between them, suspicion evident in his expression. "Just checking that everything's all right. Mrs. Peterson mentioned she saw a large figure heading toward the school after dark. As you can see, everything is fine. Mr. Wyatt is here for reading lessons." The sheriff's eyebrows rose. "Reading lessons," he repeated flatly. "Yes." Eleanor met his skeptical look with a level gaze. "Everyone deserves the opportunity to learn, wouldn't you agree?" Taylor's mouth tightened. "Miss Hayes, might I have a word with you? Privately." Eleanor hesitated, glancing back at Caleb, who stood rigid with tension. His eyes met hers, and she saw in them a resignation that troubled her, as if he expected betrayal, expected her to step outside and close the door on him. "Anything you wish to say to me can be said in Mr. Wyatt's presence," she told the sheriff firmly. Taylor's jaw tightened. "Miss Hayes, I must insist." After a moment's deliberation, Eleanor nodded. "Very well. Mr. Wyatt, please continue with page 12. I'll return shortly." She stepped outside, pulling the door almost closed behind her but deliberately leaving it ajar. The sheriff led her a few paces from the schoolhouse. In the moonlight, his expression was grave. "Miss Hayes, do you have any idea what you're doing?" he asked in a low voice. "Teaching a man to read," she replied evenly, "as is my profession." "That's not just any man, that's Caleb Wyatt." Taylor glanced toward the schoolhouse. "Do you know what they say about him up in Silverton County?" "I make it a practice not to put much stock in gossip, Sheriff." This isn't gossip, it's fact. Before he took to the mountains, Wyatt was involved in a situation with a prominent family's daughter, got her in trouble, then allegedly beat her brother half to death when he came looking for satisfaction. Eleanor felt a cold knot form in her stomach, but kept her expression neutral. Allegedly? The girl later claimed it wasn't Wyatt's child, and the brother admitted to drawing first. But by then, Wyatt had already disappeared into the high country, been living like a wild animal ever since. Or perhaps like a man who felt he had no place among people who had already judged him. Eleanor countered. Taylor sighed. "Miss Hayes, I respect your charitable nature, but being alone with that man after dark is asking for trouble, both from him and from the good people of this town. Your reputation—" "My reputation is my own concern," Eleanor interrupted, a spark of anger igniting within her. "And I would remind you, Sheriff, that nothing improper has occurred. I am providing education to someone who seeks it. If the good people of Willow Creek find that objectionable, perhaps they should examine their Christian principles more closely. It's not just about propriety. Wyatt's dangerous. He's been living outside civilization for 15 years. Who knows what that does to a man's mind?" Eleanor thought of how gently Caleb had handled the Fox kit, how carefully he had turned the pages of the primer. "I believe I can judge a man's character for myself." Taylor removed his hat, running a hand through his hair in frustration. "At least consider conducting these lessons during daylight hours, maybe at the church with others present, and subject Mr. Wyatt to more stares and whispers?" "I think not." Eleanor took a step back toward the schoolhouse. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a student waiting." "Eleanor." The sheriff rarely used her first name, and it stopped her. "Just be careful. Not everyone sees the best in people the way you do." She nodded curtly and returned to the schoolhouse, closing the door firmly behind her. Inside, she found Caleb standing exactly where she'd left him, the primer still open on the desk. "Is there trouble?" he asked, his voice low. Eleanor forced a smile. "Nothing to concern yourself with. Sheriff Taylor was simply expressing his opinion on appropriate teaching hours." Caleb's eyes, sharper than most gave him credit for, studied her face. "He told you about Silverton." The directness of his statement caught her off guard. "He mentioned an incident. And now you want me to leave?" It wasn't a question, but a weary assumption. "I did not say that." Eleanor moved closer, looking up at him directly. "Mr. Wyatt, I believe every person deserves the chance to tell their own story, not have it told by others." Something shifted in his expression, surprise perhaps, or cautious hope. After a long moment, he spoke. Girl's name was Catherine Thornton. Her father owned half the businesses in Silverton. His voice was rough with disuse, but steady. "We were close. When she found herself in trouble, her brother came after me with a knife. I defended myself. Too well." His hands clenched at his sides. "She later claimed another man was responsible. To protect me, maybe. Or because it was true. Never knew which." "And you left rather than wait to find out?" "Town was out for blood. Mine specifically. Decided the mountains were safer than a hanging tree." He met her gaze directly. "Never hurt a woman. Never would." Eleanor believed him. Perhaps it was foolish, perhaps it was her tendency to see the best in people, as the sheriff had suggested. But looking into Caleb's eyes, she could not imagine him deliberately causing harm to someone weaker than himself. "Well then," she said, returning to the desk, "let's continue with our lesson, shall we?" Relief washed over his features, subtle but unmistakable. They resumed their work, and for another hour, the outside world and its judgments ceased to exist. There was only the lamp-lit circle of their shared concentration, the satisfaction of forgotten knowledge reclaimed, and the growing ease between them. When they finally finished, the fox kit had awakened and was exploring the classroom with curious sniffs. Caleb gathered it gently, wrapping it once more in the oilcloth. "Same time tomorrow?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral, as if preparing himself for rejection. Eleanor hesitated. The prudent answer would be no. Already she could imagine the whispers that would circulate through town by morning. The school teacher alone with the wild man after dark. Her reputation, which she had guarded carefully for 8 years, could be irreparably damaged. Yet looking at Caleb, this man who had committed himself to learning with such earnest intensity, who had rescued an orphaned fox, who had lived alone with his demons for 15 years, she found she could not turn him away. "Same time," she confirmed, "but perhaps we should take a different approach to your arrival. The woods extend behind the schoolhouse. If you come from that direction, you're less likely to be observed." He nodded, understanding her meaning. "Don't want to cause trouble for you." "The trouble would be denying education to someone who truly desires it." She walked him to the door. "Good night, Mr. Wyatt." "Miss Hayes." He paused at the threshold, towering in the doorway. "Thank you." Then he was gone, a shadow melting into the darkness at the edge of town. Eleanor closed the door and leaned against it, her heart beating with an unfamiliar rhythm. What was she doing? She had spent years building a life of quiet dignity in Willow Creek, earning respect through her competence and propriety. Now she was arranging clandestine meetings with a man the town feared, a man with a troubled past and uncertain future. Yet she could not bring herself to regret it. As she extinguished the lamp and gathered her things to leave, Eleanor found herself thinking of the fox kit, torn from its mother and left vulnerable in a hostile world. Perhaps in some way that was what had happened to Caleb Wyatt. Perhaps that was what had happened to her as well, though her isolation had taken a different form. The following days brought exactly what Eleanor had expected. Whispers that fell silent when she approached, sidelong glances from the mothers who brought their children to school, pointed questions from Mrs. Peterson about that mountain man situation. Sheriff Taylor nodded to her stiffly when they passed on the street, disapproval evident in his posture. Most troubling were the children's questions. "Is it true you're teaching the wild man, Miss Hayes?" asked Tommy Williams during arithmetic. "Mr. Wyatt is learning to read, yes," she answered, keeping her tone matter-of-fact. "My pa says he's dangerous," piped up another child. "Says he lived with the Indians and went crazy." "Your father is entitled to his opinion," Eleanor replied carefully. "But in this classroom we do not spread unkind rumors about others. Now back to your multiplication tables." Despite the town's reaction, Eleanor continued the evening lessons. Caleb arrived each night as darkness fell, entering through the rear door that faced the woods. He progressed rapidly, his forgotten knowledge returning with remarkable speed. Soon they had moved beyond the primer to one of Eleanor's favorite books of poetry. "The quality of mercy is not strained," Caleb read slowly, his finger tracing beneath the words. "It droppeth as the gentle rain from heaven upon the place beneath." "Excellent," Eleanor encouraged him. "Do you understand what that means?" He was silent for a moment, considering. "That mercy should come natural, not forced." His eyes met hers. "Like what you did, standing up for me that first day." Eleanor felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the small stove heating the schoolhouse. "I simply did what was right." "Most don't," he said quietly. 2 weeks passed, the evening lessons continuing despite the growing disapproval of Willow Creek. The fox kit, which Caleb had named Copper for her russet fur, had grown stronger under his care. He often brought her to the lessons, where she would curl in his lap or explore the schoolroom while they worked. On this particular evening, rain lashed against the windows and thunder rumbled in the distance. Eleanor had lit extra lamps to ward off the gloom, but Caleb was late, later than he had ever been. She found herself pacing the length of the classroom, peering anxiously into the darkness each time lightning illuminated the landscape. When the back door finally opened, admitting a gust of wind and rain along with Caleb's massive form, Eleanor felt a rush of relief that surprised her with its intensity. "I was beginning to worry," she said, helping him hang his dripping coat near the stove. "Storm's worse up high," he replied, pushing wet hair from his face. "Creek's rising. Might cut off the lower trail by morning." Eleanor noticed he was carrying a canvas sack in addition to the usual oilcloth bundle containing copper. "Is everything all right?" Caleb hesitated, then opened the sack and withdrew a small wooden box intricately carved with a pattern of leaves and vines. "Made this," he said, holding it out to her, "for you." Eleanor accepted the box with astonishment. The craftsmanship was exquisite, each detail rendered with remarkable precision. She ran her fingers over the smooth surface, feeling the care that had gone into its creation. "It's beautiful," she said softly, opening the lid to find the interior lined with fragrant cedar. "Did you carve this yourself?" He nodded, a hint of color rising in his weathered cheeks. "For your chalk and pencils. Noticed yours was broken." Indeed, the battered tin box she used to store her teaching supplies had been falling apart for months, its lid bent and ill-fitting. That Caleb had not only noticed but had created such a thoughtful replacement touched her deeply. "Thank you," she said, looking up at him. "This is the most thoughtful gift I've received in longer than I can remember." Something shifted in Caleb's expression, a softening around his eyes that transformed his entire face. For a moment, neither spoke. The only sounds the drumming of rain on the roof and the crackle of the stove fire. The moment was broken by a sharp knock at the front door. Caleb immediately tensed, his hand moving protectively toward Copper. "Stay here," Eleanor whispered, setting the box carefully on her desk. She moved to the door, composing her features into a mask of calm before opening it. Jacob Hargrove stood on the steps, his bull-like frame silhouetted against the stormy night. Behind him stood 3 other men, including his son Timothy, a surly youth of 17 who had left school the previous year. "Mr. Hargrove," Eleanor acknowledged coolly. "It's rather late for a social call." "This ain't social, Miss Hayes." Hargrove's voice was slurred, suggesting he had been drinking at the saloon. "We know he's in there. The mountain savage." Eleanor's grip tightened on the door. "I'm afraid I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't play innocent," Timothy sneered. "Everybody knows you've been consorting with that animal after dark. Whole town's talking about it. If by consorting you mean providing reading lessons to a member of this community, then yes, I have been." Eleanor stood straighter, blocking the doorway with her body. "And I would remind you that this is school property. You have no right to be here." Hargrove stepped closer, the smell of whiskey heavy on his breath. "That man is a menace, been stealing cattle, spying on decent folk. God knows what else he's done up in those mountains." "Mr. Wyatt has done nothing wrong," Eleanor stated firmly, "and I must ask you to leave immediately." "Or what?" Timothy challenged, moving to his father's side. "You'll set your wild man on us? Let's see him try." The youth patted the pistol holstered at his hip with drunken bravado. Before Eleanor could respond, she felt a presence behind her. Caleb, standing so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body. "Go home, Hargrove," he said, his deep voice rumbling like the distant thunder. "You're frightening the lady." Hargrove's face darkened with anger. "You've got some nerve, Wyatt. Coming down from your cave, corrupting a decent woman." "Mr. Hargrove," Eleanor protested, but Caleb's hand came to rest lightly on her shoulder. "It's all right," he murmured. Then, to Hargrove, "Said what you came to say. Now leave." "Or you'll do what?" Timothy challenged, his hand hovering near his gun. The tension crackled between them like the lightning overhead. Eleanor could feel Caleb's restraint, the careful control with which he held his considerable strength in check. "Won't do anything," Caleb replied evenly. "Just asking you to respect Miss Hayes's wishes," Timothy scoffed. "As if she knows what's good for her. Probably bewitched her with some mountain magic. Everyone knows." "That's quite enough," Eleanor cut in sharply. "You will not stand on school property and insult me, Timothy Hargrove. I am still your former teacher, and you will show respect." The young man faltered slightly under her stern gaze, conditioned by years of classroom discipline. "This storm's getting worse," Caleb observed calmly. "Creek's rising. Might want to get home before the bridge floods." As if to emphasize his point, a flash of lightning illuminated the scene, followed immediately by a deafening crack of thunder. The rain intensified, coming down in sheets that had already soaked the unwelcome visitors. Hargrove hesitated, clearly torn between his drunken belligerence and the practical reality of the worsening storm. Finally, he spat on the ground. "This isn't over, Wyatt," he growled. "And you, Miss Hayes. The school board will be hearing about this." With that threat hanging in the air, the men retreated, stumbling slightly as they made their way back toward town. Eleanor closed the door with shaking hands. "I'm so sorry," she said, turning to Caleb. "They had no right to speak to you that way." "Used to it," he replied simply, but she could see the resignation in his eyes, the old pain their words had awakened. "Well, I'm not," she said fiercely, "and I won't tolerate it." Outside, the storm continued to intensify. A particularly violent gust of wind rattled the schoolhouse windows, and Copper whimpered from her bundle on the desk. Caleb moved to the window, peering out at the darkness. "Bridge will be underwater soon," he said grimly. "Trail back to my cabin too." Eleanor understood the implications immediately. "You can't return to the mountains tonight." He nodded, his expression troubled. "And you can't make it back to your boarding house safely." They looked at each other, acknowledging the predicament. To remain together in the schoolhouse all night would confirm the town's worst suspicions about them, yet the alternatives seemed increasingly dangerous as the storm raged outside. "There's a storage room," Eleanor said finally, practical concerns overriding social ones. "It has a cot where I sometimes rest during lunch. You could stay there." Caleb's expression remained grave. "What about your reputation?" The question touched her. Even now, facing possible danger, his concern was for her standing in the community. "My reputation is already compromised, according to Mr. Hargrove," she said with a wry smile. "Besides, we have a chaperone." She nodded toward Copper, who had emerged from her bundle and was watching them with bright, curious eyes. A ghost of a smile touched Caleb's lips. "Not sure she counts." The storm showed no signs of abating, and Eleanor busied herself making the schoolhouse as comfortable as possible for an overnight stay. She added wood to the stove, arranged the cot in the storage room for Caleb, and found an old quilt she kept for particularly cold days. "You should take the cot," Caleb insisted. "I can sleep on the floor." "Absolutely not," Eleanor countered. "You're far too large for the floor. I'll be perfectly comfortable at my desk." Their familiar bickering had an oddly domestic quality that Eleanor found both unsettling and comforting. As the night deepened and the storm continued its assault on the little schoolhouse, they sat near the stove, Copper curled between them, and continued their reading lesson as if it were any other evening. "Tell me about your cabin," Eleanor said when they had finished the assigned passage. "What is it like living in the mountains?" Caleb was quiet for a moment, as if considering how to describe his solitary existence. "Peaceful," he said finally. No judgment there. Just the trees and sky and animals. They don't care about your past. Don't you get lonely? The question slipped out before she could reconsider its propriety. His eyes met hers, startlingly blue in the lamplight. Used to it, he said again, but then added more softly, but yes, sometimes. The simple admission, offered without self-pity, moved her deeply. How many nights had she sat alone in her small room at Mrs. Peterson's boarding house, surrounded by books and respectability, yet aching with a similar loneliness? I understand, she whispered, and in that moment, with the storm raging outside and the lamplight casting warm shadows across their faces, Eleanor realized that she did understand, perhaps better than anyone in Willow Creek could have imagined. Eleanor woke to the gentle sound of rain pattering on the schoolhouse roof. The violent storm of the night before had softened to a steady drizzle, and pale morning light filtered through the windows. For a moment she was disoriented, stiff from sleeping in her chair. Then she remembered Caleb, the confrontation with Hargrove, the flooded roads. She straightened, pushing a strand of hair from her face. The stove had burned low, but the room remained reasonably warm. From the storage room came no sound. Had Caleb already left? The answer came in the form of a soft rustling near her feet. She looked down to find Copper exploring the hem of her skirt, the fox kit's bright eyes curious and alert. A moment later, the storage room door opened and Caleb emerged, ducking his head beneath the low frame. He had clearly attempted to make himself presentable, his wild hair tied back, his shirt tucked in neatly. "Morning," he said, his voice even rougher than usual with sleep. "Didn't want to wake you." "Good morning." Eleanor felt suddenly self-conscious about her rumpled appearance. That is, the children will be arriving soon." Caleb nodded, understanding immediately. "I'll go. Back way." The creek, lowered enough to cross. He moved to the window, surveying the wet landscape. Still high, though. Children from outlying farms might not make it in. Eleanor joined him at the window, keeping a proper distance between them. The schoolyard was a sea of mud, and beyond it, she could see that the creek had indeed swelled well beyond its banks, though it no longer appeared to be rising. "Perhaps I should cancel classes today," she mused. "Would be safer," Caleb agreed. He hesitated, then added, "Could show you." "Show me what?" "My cabin, up in the hills." The invitation was offered casually, but she could sense the significance behind it. No one would find you there. Could wait out the flood. The suggestion sent a shiver of something, not fear, not exactly, down Eleanor's spine. To go with him to his mountain refuge, to step into the solitary world he had created for himself. It was both tempting and terrifying. "I couldn't possibly," she said, though without much conviction. "It would be improper." Caleb's eyes held hers unblinking. "More improper than spending the night here? Town already thinks the worst." He was right, of course. After Hargrove's visit and their night together in the schoolhouse, her reputation hung by a thread. If the school board called an emergency meeting as Hargrove had threatened, she might well find herself dismissed by day's end. Before she could respond, the sound of approaching voices reached them. Eleanor moved quickly to the front window and saw, to her dismay, a small group making their way toward the schoolhouse. Sheriff Taylor, Reverend Phillips, and 3 members of the school board, including Mrs. Thornton, the only female member. "They're coming," she whispered, turning back to Caleb with alarm. "The school board, the sheriff." Caleb was already gathering Copper and his few belongings. "Back door?" "Yes, quickly." She helped him into his still damp coat. "But what will you do? Where will you go?" "Offer still stands," he said, pausing at the rear door. "My cabin." Follow the creek upstream about 2 miles, then look for trail marked with 3 stones stacked. Leads to ridge. The voices were drawing nearer. Any moment now, they would be at the front steps. "I can't just leave," Eleanor protested. "I have responsibilities, students." "After," Caleb said simply. Then, with a gentleness that belied his size, he touched her cheek with calloused fingers. "If you need, I'll be there." Before she could respond, he was gone, slipping into the misty morning with the silent grace of a man long accustomed to avoiding notice. Eleanor barely had time to straighten her desk and pinch color into her pale cheeks before the knock came at the front door. She took a deep breath, smoothed her skirts, and went to answer it. Sheriff Taylor stood at the front of the group, his expression grave. "Miss Hayes," he greeted her with a nod. "May we come in?" "Of course." She stepped aside, keeping her face composed despite the hammering of her heart. "Though I must say, this is an unexpected visit. I was just considering whether to cancel classes due to the flooding." The group filed in, their wet boots leaving muddy tracks on the clean floor. Mrs. Thornton surveyed the room with sharp eyes, clearly looking for evidence of impropriety. "Miss Hayes," began Mr. Collins, the head of the school board, "serious concerns have been brought to our attention regarding your activities outside of school hours." Eleanor clasped her hands before her to hide their trembling. "I assume you're referring to my providing reading lessons to Mr. Wyatt." "Among other things," Mrs. Thornton said pointedly. "Jacob Hargrove claims he found you and that mountain man together here last night, unchaperoned." "Mr. Hargrove and his son arrived uninvited and intoxicated," Eleanor corrected calmly. "They were making threats against Mr. Wyatt, who has done nothing wrong except seek education." "The man has a history," Reverend Phillips interjected, "a violent one." "A history that has been greatly exaggerated," Eleanor countered. "And even if it were not, does not the good book teach us about redemption, about second chances?" The Reverend shifted uncomfortably, unwilling to argue against the principles he preached each Sunday. Sheriff Taylor cleared his throat. "The issue at hand, Miss Hayes, is not just Mr. Wyatt's character, but the propriety of your association with him. You are responsible for shaping young minds. The community expects certain standards of behavior. Standards that apparently do not include Christian charity or the belief that education should be available to all," Eleanor replied, anger beginning to override her fear. "Mr. Wyatt has shown nothing but respect and a genuine desire to learn. Meanwhile, Mr. Hargrove and his son arrived at this schoolhouse armed and threatening violence. Which behavior should concern this community more?" The school board members exchanged uneasy glances. It was clear they had expected her to be apologetic, perhaps tearful, not righteously indignant. "Nevertheless," Mr. Collins continued, "appearances matter, Miss Hayes, and the appearance of you alone with Mr. Wyatt, especially overnight." "We were not alone by choice," Eleanor interrupted. "The storm made travel impossible. Would you have preferred we risked our lives in a flood?" Mrs. Thornton's gaze narrowed. "Where is he now?" "Mr. Wyatt left at first light, as soon as it was safe to do so." "And you expect us to believe nothing untoward occurred?" Mrs. Thornton pressed. Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks, partly from embarrassment, partly from outrage. "I expect to be treated with the respect I have earned through 8 years of dedicated service to this community. I expect not to have my character questioned based on nothing more than malicious gossip." A tense silence fell over the room. Eleanor realized she had perhaps gone too far, but she could not bring herself to regret her words. After years of carefully maintaining her reputation, of accepting the constraints placed upon her as a single woman in a small town, something had shifted within her. Perhaps it was Caleb's influence, his unapologetic existence outside society's expectations. Finally, Sheriff Taylor spoke. Miss Hayes, no one is questioning your years of service. But this situation has created talk. The kind of talk that can undermine your authority with the children and their parents. So I am to be punished not for any actual wrongdoing, but for talk. Eleanor's voice was quiet but firm. Mr. Collins sighed heavily. The school board will need to meet formally to discuss the matter. Until then, we think it best if classes are indeed canceled, as you suggested, for a few days at least. Eleanor understood what they were not saying directly. She was being temporarily suspended, pending a formal decision about her future as Willow Creek's teacher. And Mr. Wyatt, she asked. Would be wise for him to return to his mountain and stay there, Sheriff Taylor said, for everyone's sake. After they left, Eleanor stood alone in the empty schoolhouse, the silence pressing in around her. 8 years of her life had been invested in this room, in the children who filled it with laughter and questions. Now it might all be taken from her because she had dared to show kindness to a man the town had chosen to fear. Outside, the rain continued to fall softly. The creek would remain high for at least another day. In her mind, Eleanor could hear Caleb's words. Follow the creek upstream about 2 miles, then look for trail marked with 3 stones stacked. Leads to ridge. She had never been one to run from difficulties, had never shirked her responsibilities or abandoned her principles in the face of opposition, but neither had she ever faced losing everything she had worked for, everything that defined her place in the world. Eleanor moved to her desk and opened the carved wooden box Caleb had given her. Her fingers traced the intricate pattern of leaves and vines, feeling the care and attention that had gone into its creation. This was the work of a man capable of beauty and gentleness, not the dangerous savage the town perceived. Slowly, deliberately, she began gathering her most precious belongings, her journal, a volume of poetry, the small silver locket that had belonged to her mother. Whatever the school board decided, she needed time to think, to consider her options away from the whispers and judgmental glances of Willow Creek, following a creek upstream, looking for 3 stacked stones. It seemed like the beginning of a different story altogether, one she had never imagined herself part of. Yet here she was, contemplating exactly that. Eleanor Hayes, respectable schoolteacher, was about to make the most improper decision of her life. Eleanor left the schoolhouse as the afternoon shadows lengthened across Willow Creek. She had changed into her sturdiest boots and simplest dress, a small satchel containing essential belongings slung over her shoulder. To anyone who might observe her, she appeared to be merely returning to her boarding house after a difficult day. But instead of turning toward Mrs. Peterson's, Eleanor walked purposefully toward the edge of town, her heart pounding with the enormity of what she was about to do. She had left a brief note for Mrs. Peterson explaining that she needed time alone to consider her situation and would return in a few days. It wasn't precisely a lie, though it omitted the most significant truth, that she was seeking refuge with the very man who had caused her current predicament. The creek was still swollen but no longer raging as she followed its course upstream, away from Willow Creek and into the foothills. The recent rain had left the path muddy and treacherous in places, forcing her to pick her way carefully over slippery rocks and around newly formed pools of standing water. Eleanor had never ventured this far into the wilderness alone. Though she had grown up on a small farm and was no stranger to physical labor, the terrain grew increasingly challenging as she climbed higher. Twice she nearly turned back, questioning the wisdom of her impulsive decision. What did she really know about Caleb Wyatt beyond their evening lessons and the town's rumors? What kind of life had he built for himself in these remote mountains? Yet something drove her forward, curiosity perhaps, or the stubborn determination not to be defined by Willow Creek's narrow expectations. Or maybe it was simply that she had nowhere else to go, at least until the school board made their final decision. 2 miles felt much longer on the rugged path. The afternoon sun was beginning to dip toward the western peaks when Eleanor finally spotted what she had been searching for. 3 stones carefully stacked one atop another beside a narrow trail that branched away from the creek, climbing steeply up the ridge. Follow the creek upstream about 2 miles, then look for trail marked with 3 stones stacked. Leads to ridge. Caleb's directions echoed in her mind as she paused to catch her breath. The trail was barely visible, more animal track than human path, winding through dense pine forest and across rocky outcroppings. Eleanor's legs ached from the unaccustomed exertion, and her hair had come loose from its neat bun, falling in damp tendrils around her face. Yet there was something unexpectedly exhilarating about the journey, about moving further and further beyond the boundaries of her usual existence. As the trail crested a small rise, Eleanor stopped, momentarily stunned by the vista that opened before her. The mountains stretched in all directions, their peaks painted gold and pink by the setting sun. Below, the valley cradled Willow Creek, now merely a collection of tiny buildings beside the silver ribbon of the creek. From this height, the town that had loomed so large in her life seemed insignificant against the vast landscape. The path continued upward, skirting the edge of a steep drop that made Eleanor's stomach lurch. She pressed on, one careful step at a time, until the trail finally leveled out onto a small plateau nestled between 2 ridgelines. There, partially concealed among tall pines, stood Caleb Wyatt's cabin. Eleanor had expected something primitive, a crude shelter befitting the wild man of the town's imagination. Instead, she found herself looking at a well-constructed log dwelling, its solid walls and carefully fitted stone chimney speaking of skilled craftsmanship. A small covered porch faced the valley, and neat stacks of firewood lined one wall. Nearby stood a smaller structure that appeared to be a workshop, judging by the tools visible through its open door. For a moment, Eleanor hesitated at the edge of the clearing, suddenly uncertain of her welcome despite Caleb's invitation. What if he had merely been polite? What if he preferred his solitude to her company? Before she could decide whether to announce herself or retreat, the cabin door opened and Caleb emerged, copper cradled in one arm. He spotted her immediately, pausing with an expression of genuine surprise. "You came," he said simply, the words carrying across the clearing. Eleanor squared her shoulders. "Yes, I hope your invitation still stands." He moved toward her with his characteristic economy of motion, stopping a respectful distance away. Up close she could see that he had bathed and changed into clean clothes since their parting that morning. His beard was neatly trimmed, and his hair, though still long, had been combed back from his face. "Always," he said. Then with a hint of concern, "The town?" "The school board has suspended me, at least temporarily." Eleanor found it difficult to keep the hurt from her voice. "They will meet to decide my fate, as if I were a criminal rather than someone who dared to teach a man to read." Anger flashed in Caleb's eyes. "Because of me." "Because of their own prejudice and small-mindedness," Eleanor corrected firmly. "I made my choices freely." He studied her for a long moment, then nodded toward the cabin. "Come, rest. You've walked far." The interior of the cabin was a revelation. Though small, it was immaculately kept, with a smooth plank floor partially covered by a hand-woven rug. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its mantel adorned with carved wooden figures, a deer, an eagle, a fox that resembled copper. Bookshelves lined another wall, filled with volumes that Eleanor recognized from their lessons, and many more besides. "You have books," she said, unable to hide her astonishment. "Started collecting again after our lessons began," Caleb explained, setting Copper down. The fox kid immediately scampered to Eleanor, sniffing curiously at her muddied hem. Remembered how much they mattered. A small table stood beneath the window, set with 2 hand-thrown clay plates. A pot simmered on the cast-iron stove in the corner, filling the cabin with the savory aroma of rabbit stew. "You were expecting me," Eleanor realized. Caleb shrugged, looking almost self-conscious. Hoped, he corrected. Sit. You must be tired. Eleanor sank gratefully onto a chair, her legs trembling slightly from the long climb. As Caleb moved about the cabin, ladling stew into bowls, cutting bread that he had clearly baked himself, she found herself observing him with new eyes. Here, in his own space, he moved with quiet confidence, without the wariness that characterized his presence in town. This was Caleb Wyatt as he truly was, not the fearsome mountain man of Willow Creek's imagination. Your home is lovely, she said as he placed a steaming bowl before her. Did you build it yourself? He nodded, taking the seat across from her. Started small, added on each year. And all these books, you've read them? Most. Some were my mother's. His eyes met hers across the table. Some bought in Sterling when I go to trade furs. 3 days' journey, but they don't know me there. The thought of Caleb making a 3-day journey specifically to purchase books touched Eleanor deeply. How long had he been quietly educating himself, even before she began teaching him? They ate in companionable silence as darkness fell outside the windows. Caleb lit a lamp, its warm glow casting soft shadows around the cabin. Eleanor found herself relaxing despite the impropriety of her situation. An unmarried woman sharing a meal alone with a man in his home, miles from civilization. The school board, Caleb said, finally breaking the silence. What will they do? Eleanor sighed, setting down her spoon. I don't know. The town is divided. Some, like Hargrove, want me dismissed immediately. Others value my teaching enough to overlook what they see as a lapse in judgment. Teaching me? Yes. She met his gaze directly. Though I would do it again, despite the consequences. Something flickered in his eyes. Gratitude, perhaps, or something deeper. Why? The question hung between them, simple, yet profound. Why had she risked everything? Her position, her reputation, her very identity as Willow Creek's respectable schoolteacher. For this man? Because it was right, she said softly. Because everyone deserves the chance to learn, to grow beyond the limitations others place upon them. She paused, then added, and because I saw in you something the others couldn't or wouldn't see, a man of intelligence and gentleness despite what the world has done to you. Caleb looked away, seemingly uncomfortable with her assessment. After a moment he rose and moved to the fireplace, adding another log to the flames. You can have the bed, he said, changing the subject. I'll sleep by the fire. Eleanor began to protest, but he shook his head firmly. Not up for discussion. As he prepared a pallet near the hearth, Eleanor took the opportunity to observe her surroundings more closely. Everything in the cabin spoke of careful attention to detail, from the smoothly joined logs to the hand-carved utensils. This was not the dwelling of a man who had gone wild, but rather one who had created order and beauty in his solitude. How did you learn to build like this? She asked as he arranged blankets near the fire. To carve? To make all these things? Caleb considered the question as he worked. Father was a carpenter before he took up farming. Taught me some. Rest I figured out. Plenty of time to practice up here. 15 years, Eleanor murmured, recalling his words from their first encounter. I've been alone for 15 years. He looked up at her, his expression unreadable in the firelight. Not always alone by choice, he had told her once. Now, surrounded by the evidence of the life he had built for himself, she wondered again what had driven him to such extreme isolation. As if reading her thoughts, he spoke quietly. After Silverton, couldn't face people, their judgment, their fear. He gestured around the cabin. Here, I answer to no one, live by my own rules. But you came back down, Eleanor observed. To town. Why? Caleb was silent for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the dancing flames. "Got tired," he said finally, his voice so low she had to lean forward to hear it, "of being alone." Morning came with golden light filtering through the cabin's east-facing window, waking Eleanor from the deepest sleep she had experienced in years. For a moment she was disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings. The rough-hewn beams overhead, the handmade quilt covering her, the scent of pine and wood smoke that permeated everything. Then she remembered where she was and sat up quickly, smoothing her rumpled dress. Caleb was nowhere to be seen, though the pallet by the hearth had been neatly folded. Copper dozed in a small basket near the stove, which radiated gentle warmth, suggesting it had been stoked recently. Eleanor rose and went to the window. Outside, the world was transformed. Yesterday's clouds had cleared, revealing a landscape of startling beauty. Mountain peaks rising like sentinels around the small plateau, valleys stretching into misty distances, and everywhere the vibrant green of pine forest. Near the edge of the clearing, Caleb was splitting wood, his powerful arms swinging an axe in a rhythm that spoke of long practice. She watched him for a moment, struck by how at home he seemed in this wild place. Here, surrounded by nature rather than society's judgment, he moved with an ease and confidence she had never witnessed in town. The mountain man label that had been applied with fear and suspicion in Willow Creek seemed in this context not an insult but simply a statement of fact. He was a man of the mountains, as much a part of this landscape as the trees and stones. Catching sight of movement at the window, Caleb paused mid-swing, then set down his axe and approached the cabin. Eleanor stepped back, suddenly conscious of her disheveled appearance after sleeping in her clothes. "Good morning," she greeted him when he entered, one hand instinctively rising to smooth her hair. "Morning." His eyes took in her rumpled state with something that might have been amusement. "Sleep well?" "Better than I have in longer than I can remember," she admitted. "Your mountain air must agree with me." He nodded toward a basin of water he had prepared for her. "Thought you might want a wash. There's a stream nearby for bathing if you prefer." Eleanor thanked him, grateful for his thoughtfulness. After refreshing herself and rebraiding her hair, she joined Caleb outside, where he was preparing a simple breakfast over a small fire pit. "Do you always cook outdoors?" she asked, accepting a tin cup of strong coffee. "When weather allows, like the open air." He turned a pan of frying cornbread, the scent making Eleanor's stomach growl appreciatively. "Town feels confined." Eleanor understood. Even the schoolhouse, which she had always considered spacious, would seem claustrophobic compared to this vast openness. "What will you do?" Caleb asked as they ate, sitting on logs positioned near the fire. "If they dismiss you?" The question brought reality crashing back. In the peace of the mountain morning, Eleanor had momentarily forgotten the precariousness of her situation. "I don't know," she admitted. "Teaching is all I've done for 8 years. All I know how to do, really." Caleb considered this. Could teach elsewhere, other towns. Perhaps. But the prospect of starting over somewhere new, proving herself again to strangers, was daunting. "And you? Will you continue coming to town for lessons despite everything?" He was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the distant peaks. "Don't know," he said finally. "Wanted to learn, wanted to reconnect, but not at your expense." The simple declaration touched her. How many people in her life had considered her welfare ahead of their own desires? After breakfast, Caleb showed her around his small homestead, the workshop where he crafted furniture and carvings, the vegetable garden terraced into the hillside, the cleverly designed system of gutters that collected rainwater in barrels. Everything spoke of ingenuity and patient labor, of a life built piece by piece over 15 solitary years. "It's remarkable." Eleanor said as they stood beside a small natural spring he had lined with stones. Most men in town assume you've been living like some kind of primitive savage all these years. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. Easier that way. If they fear me, they leave me alone. But it's not the truth. Truth is complicated. He knelt to adjust a wooden channel that directed the spring water. After Silverton, truth didn't matter much. People believed what they wanted. Eleanor sat on a nearby boulder, watching him work. "Tell me what really happened," she said quietly. "If you want to, that is." Caleb's hands stilled. For a long moment he remained silent, and Eleanor feared she had overstepped. Then he sat back on his heels, his eyes meeting hers with unexpected directness. "Catherine Thornton was the banker's daughter," he began, his voice low but steady. "I was hired to build shelves in her father's office. She would bring me water, talk to me while I worked. Seemed to see past." He gestured vaguely at himself, at the intimidating size and strength that had always set him apart. "You fell in love," Eleanor supplied gently. "She did, or thought she did." His expression grew distant. "I was careful. Knew nothing could come of it. Poor carpenter's son, rich banker's daughter. But she was persistent." Eleanor could imagine the scene. A sheltered young woman fascinated by a strong, silent craftsman so different from the polished young men of her social circle. "When she found herself in trouble," Caleb continued, "her father assumed it was me. Truth was, she'd been seeing the mayor's son secretly for months. I was just the convenient excuse." "And her brother attacked you?" Caleb nodded. "Came at me with a knife while I was loading lumber. Didn't give me a chance to explain." His hand unconsciously moved to a scar visible at the edge of his collar. "Defended myself too well. He hit his head on a wagon wheel when he fell." "You thought you'd killed him," Eleanor realized. "He wasn't moving. There was blood." Caleb's voice had grown rougher with the memory. "People were gathering. Someone shouted murder. I ran. But he survived. Found out later. By then I was in the mountains, living off hunting and trapping. Days became weeks. Weeks became months." He looked around at the homestead he had created. "Started building this place, thinking it was temporary. Then Catherine married the mayor's son, and I knew the truth would never come out. So you stayed. Easier than facing a world that had already judged me." He rose, brushing dirt from his hands. "After a while, isolation became comfortable, safe." Eleanor considered his story, the injustice of it, the way a single misunderstanding had altered the course of his life so dramatically. "And in all that time, you never thought to clear your name, to return and tell your side? Who would believe me? Poor man against rich families." He shook his head. "Besides, mountains taught me something important." "What's that?" "Most things people fight over don't matter." He gestured toward the vast landscape surrounding them. "Up here only survival matters. Everything else is just noise." There was wisdom in his perspective, Eleanor had to admit. How much of her own anxiety stemmed from concerns about what others thought, about maintaining appearances and meeting expectations that suddenly seemed arbitrary in this mountain setting. "But you did come back," she reminded him, "for the reading lessons." Caleb nodded, a hint of vulnerability crossing his weathered features. 15 years is a long time to talk only to yourself." He paused, started feeling like I was disappearing, needed to remind myself I was still a man, still part of the world. The admission, offered without self-pity, struck Eleanor with its simple honesty. How courageous it must have been for him to venture back into a society that had rejected him, risking fresh judgment and fear, simply because the human need for connection had finally outweighed the safety of solitude. "I'm glad you did," she said softly. Their eyes met, and in that moment, something shifted between them, a recognition of shared understanding that transcended the vast differences in their experiences. Both had been living lives of isolation, though of very different kinds. Both had been constrained by others' perceptions and expectations, and both were now standing at the edge of something new and undefined, terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. The moment was broken by Copper, who darted between them, chasing a butterfly with playful determination. Eleanor laughed, the tension easing as they watched the fox kit's antics. She's growing stronger, she observed. We'll release her soon, Caleb said, though there was reluctance in his voice. When she's ready, back to her own kind. Will you miss her? He considered the question seriously. Yes, but keeping her wouldn't be right. Wild things need freedom. The simple philosophy seemed to encompass so much more than just the fox kit. Eleanor thought of Willow Creek, of the life she had built there, respectable, predictable, confined. Had she been like Copper, rescued and cared for, but ultimately meant for something wilder and more true? As the sun climbed higher in the sky, casting shorter shadows across the mountain plateau, Eleanor realized that her time in this place was already changing her in ways she couldn't yet fully comprehend. Whatever the school board decided, whatever path lay ahead, she could not be exactly the same woman who had walked up that mountain trail the day before. The day passed in a rhythm entirely unlike Eleanor's carefully structured school routine. She helped Caleb tend his garden, learning the names of the wild herbs he cultivated alongside more familiar vegetables. He showed her how to identify edible mushrooms growing in the shadow of fallen logs, how to listen for the particular rustle that meant a grouse was nearby, how to read the clouds for signs of approaching weather. Storm coming, he observed late in the afternoon, pointing toward dark clouds gathering over the western peaks. Not like last night, worse. Eleanor followed his gaze, surprised at how quickly the perfect blue sky had begun to change. How can you tell? Air pressure, birds gone quiet. He turned in a slow circle, surveying the mountains with practiced eyes, wind shifting too fast. As they walked back toward the cabin, Eleanor felt the first stirrings of an unfamiliar contentment. Despite the impropriety of her situation, despite the uncertainty awaiting her in Willow Creek, there was something about this simple day spent learning and working alongside Caleb that felt right in a way she couldn't quite articulate. I should return tomorrow, she said as they reached the cabin, where Copper greeted them with enthusiastic yips. The school board will have met by then. Caleb nodded, though something like disappointment flickered across his features. Trail will be dangerous if storm hits. Might need to wait. Inside, they worked together, preparing a simple supper, moving around the small space with an ease that surprised Eleanor. There was none of the awkwardness she might have expected, none of the careful distance that propriety would have demanded in town. Here, practical concerns outweighed social conventions. Vegetables needed chopping, water needed fetching, the fire needed tending. As darkness fell and the wind began to rise, they sat before the fireplace with cups of strong tea, Copper curled between them on the hearthrug. Outside, the first rumbles of thunder echoed between the peaks. Will your cabin withstand the storm? Eleanor asked, noting how the wind had begun to whistle around the eaves. Built it to last, Caleb replied with quiet confidence. Lived through worse than this. There was something comforting about his certainty, about the solid presence he provided against the growing wildness of the night. Eleanor found herself studying his profile in the firelight, the strong line of his jaw beneath his beard, the thoughtful set of his mouth, the small scar near his right eye that she had never noticed before. What was she like? She asked suddenly. Catherine Thornton. Caleb looked up, clearly surprised by the question. For a moment, Eleanor thought he might not answer. Then he set down his cup, his expression distant with memory. Young, he said finally, sheltered, curious about everything. A hint of old pain crossed his features. Thought she wanted adventure, really just wanted to defy her father. And you? What did you want? He considered the question with characteristic thoroughness. Someone who saw me, he said quietly. Not just this. He gestured at his imposing frame. Someone who wasn't afraid. The simple honesty of his answer touched something deep within Eleanor. How many times had she longed for the same thing? To be seen for who she truly was, beyond her role as the town schoolteacher, beyond the careful persona she had constructed? I understand, she said softly. People see what they expect to see. The fearsome mountain man, the proper spinster teacher. Not what you are, Caleb observed, his blue eyes intent on her face. No? Then what am I? He studied her for a long moment. Brave, he said finally. Strong-minded. Kind when it costs you something. The assessment, delivered without flattery or artifice, warmed Eleanor more than the fire before them. When was the last time anyone had truly seen her, had recognized the person beneath the carefully maintained exterior? And you, she countered, are not the wild man they fear in town. You're thoughtful, gentle, more educated than most who call you savage. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. Maybe we're both more than people think. Outside, the storm had intensified, rain lashing against the windows and wind howling around the cabin's sturdy walls. Yet inside, in the circle of firelight, Eleanor felt a sense of safety she had rarely experienced, not the constrained security of social approval, but something deeper and more authentic. The quiet moment was shattered by a sudden pounding at the door, so unexpected that Eleanor gasped and Copper leapt to her feet with a startled yip. Caleb was instantly alert, rising with fluid grace that belied his size. "Stay back," he murmured, moving toward the door with cautious steps. "No one comes up here, especially not in a storm." Eleanor's heart raced as he lifted the heavy wooden bar securing the door. Who could possibly have found them here, miles from town and in the midst of a tempest? The door swung open to reveal Sheriff Taylor, drenched and wind-battered, his hat long since lost to the gale. Behind him, equally soaked, stood young Tom Peterson, looking equal parts terrified and determined. "Miss Hayes," Taylor gasped, water streaming from his oilskin coat. "Thank God we found you." Caleb stepped aside, allowing the bedraggled visitors to enter. Eleanor moved forward, concern overriding her surprise. "Sheriff Tom, what on earth are you doing up here in this weather?" "Looking for you," Taylor said grimly, accepting the blanket Caleb silently offered. "Been searching since morning. Boy here was the only one who knew which way you might have gone." Tom avoided her gaze, clearly uncomfortable with his role in the situation. "Saw you heading upstream yesterday. Figured you were coming here." Eleanor felt a flush of embarrassment, realizing what this scene must look like to the newcomers, she and Caleb alone in his cabin, the domestic coziness of their fireside arrangement. Yet the sheriff seemed too preoccupied with some urgent matter to comment on the impropriety. "What's happened?" she asked, dread building within her. "Is it the school board?" Taylor shook his head, water dripping from his mustache. "It's Hargrove. Him and a group of men have been drinking at the saloon all day, working themselves into a fury over," he glanced uncomfortably at Caleb, "over the situation between you two. They're planning to come up here at first light. With guns." Caleb's expression hardened, though he showed no surprise. "Looking for a fight?" "More than that," Taylor said grimly. "Hargrove's talking about running you off for good, or worse." Eleanor felt sick. This is absurd. Mr. Wyatt has done nothing wrong. Doesn't matter to men like Hargrove, Caleb said quietly. Never has. We need to go back, Taylor insisted, turning to Eleanor. Both of you, now. In this storm? Eleanor gestured toward the windows, where rain continued to lash with undiminished fury. It's madness. Staying here is worse, Tom spoke up, his young face serious beyond his years. My pa says Hargrove's got at least 10 men with him, all armed. Caleb moved to the fireplace, adding another log to the flames with deliberate calm. You should go, he said to Eleanor, his back still turned. When storm lets up enough, Sheriff will see you safe. And leave you here to face them alone? The very thought filled her with horror. Absolutely not. He turned to face her, his expression unreadable. My choice to stay. My fight. It became my fight the moment I offered you reading lessons, Eleanor countered, a strange, fierce energy filling her. I will not abandon you to face a mob alone. Sheriff Taylor cleared his throat awkwardly. Miss Hayes, with all due respect, your presence might inflame the situation further. These men have been drinking, and they've got it in their heads that Wyatt has compromised you somehow. That is utterly ridiculous, Eleanor snapped, her patience finally breaking. I am a grown woman who made a conscious choice to visit Mr. Wyatt's home. If anyone has compromised my reputation, it is the gossips of Willow Creek with their small minds and smaller hearts. Silence fell in the cabin, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the howling of the wind outside. Sheriff Taylor looked uncomfortable, Tom openly astonished, and Caleb was watching her with an expression she had never seen before, a mixture of amazement and something deeper that made her heart beat faster. Nevertheless, Taylor said finally, we need to decide on a course of action. Hargrove and his men will come at dawn, storm or no storm. Then we'll be ready for them, Eleanor declared, surprising herself with her own vehemence. Caleb crossed to her side, his voice low and intended for her ears alone. Eleanor, this isn't your battle. It was the first time he had used her given name, and the sound of it in his deep voice sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with fear. Yes, she said simply, meeting his gaze with unwavering determination. It is. Dawn broke with terrible beauty over the mountains, the storm having passed in the night to leave a landscape washed clean, glistening with raindrops that caught the first rays of sunlight like scattered diamonds. Under different circumstances, Eleanor might have paused to admire the vista. Instead, she stood on Caleb's porch, scanning the trail that wound up from the valley below. The night had been long, filled with tense planning and little rest. Sheriff Taylor had reluctantly agreed that returning to town through the storm would be more dangerous than staying, though he had insisted that Eleanor sleep in the workshop while the men took turns keeping watch in the cabin. Now, as morning light spilled across the plateau, the immediacy of the threat loomed large. See anything? Caleb asked, emerging from the cabin with a rifle in his hands. Eleanor shook her head. Not yet. He came to stand beside her, his presence solid and reassuring despite the danger they faced. In the clear light of morning, the decision to stay seemed both foolhardy and inevitable. She couldn't have left him, not after everything they had shared, not knowing what awaited him. Still time for you to go, he said quietly. Sheriff could take you down the eastern trail. Hargrove wouldn't see you. I'm staying, she replied, the same answer she had given each time he suggested it throughout the night. This ends today, one way or another. Inside the cabin, Sheriff Taylor and Tom were preparing for the confrontation in their own ways. Taylor checking his pistol with grim determination, Tom nervously peering out windows between bites of the breakfast Caleb had insisted they all eat. They're coming, Tom called suddenly, his young voice cracking with tension. I can see them on the lower switchback. Eleanor and Caleb returned inside, joining the others at the window. In the distance, a line of riders was indeed visible, making their way up the narrow mountain trail. Even from this distance, there was something ominous in their steady approach, in the determined set of their posture. 10 men, like the boy said, Taylor observed grimly, all armed by the look of it. "What exactly is your plan, Sheriff?" Eleanor asked, anxiety tightening her throat. Taylor sighed heavily. "Stand between them and Wyatt. Remind them that I'm the law in this county, not Jacob Hargrove." He didn't sound particularly confident in this strategy. Caleb had moved to a wooden chest in the corner, from which he withdrew a second rifle. This he offered to Taylor, who accepted it with a nod of thanks. "Boy should stay inside," Caleb said, nodding toward Tom. "I'm not afraid," Tom protested, though his pale face suggested otherwise. "Courage isn't the issue," Eleanor told him gently, "but we need someone to be our witness in case—" She couldn't finish the thought. As the riders drew nearer, Caleb turned to Eleanor, his expression grave. "Whatever happens, want you to know something." He seemed to struggle for words, this man who had spent 15 years in near silence. "Meeting you. Learning from you. Best thing that's happened to me in longer than I can remember." The simple declaration, offered without embellishment, moved Eleanor deeply. "And you," she said softly, "have reminded me what it means to live truthfully, not just according to others' expectations." For a moment they stood looking at each other, a world of unspoken feeling passing between them. Then Sheriff Taylor cleared his throat. "They're here." The four of them moved to the porch, forming an unlikely line of defense, the sheriff with his badge gleaming in the morning sun, Caleb towering beside him, Eleanor standing straight-backed and resolute, and young Tom slightly behind them, his face a mixture of terror and determination. Jacob Hargrove led the approaching men, his ruddy face already flushed with anger or alcohol, or both. He reined in his horse at the edge of the clearing, the other riders fanning out behind him in a loose semicircle. "Well, well," he called, his voice carrying easily in the clear mountain air. "Quite the welcoming committee." "Turn around, Hargrove," Sheriff Taylor responded evenly. "Whatever you came here to do, it ends now." Hargrove's gaze shifted to Eleanor, his expression darkening further. "So it's true. Our respectable school teacher, spending nights with the mountain savage." He spat on the ground. "Disgraceful." Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks, but she held her ground. "The only disgrace here is a group of grown men riding armed into the mountains to threaten a person who has done nothing to harm them." "Nothing?" Timothy Hargrove spoke up from beside his father, his young face twisted with malice. "He's been stealing cattle, spying on decent folk." "He's been doing no such thing," Eleanor interrupted. "You've invented reasons to fear him because you can't bear the thought that he chooses to live differently than you do." "Enough talk," Hargrove Sr. growled. "We didn't come up here to debate with a woman who's forgotten her place." He turned his attention to Caleb. "You're leaving these mountains today, Wyatt, one way or another." Caleb stood immovable, his rifle held loose but ready at his side. "This is my home," he said simply. "Built it with my own hands. Haven't harmed anyone." "Your very presence is harmful," Hargrove countered. "Corrupting our teacher, frightening decent folk." "The only one frightening anyone is you, Jacob," came a new voice from the trail behind them. All heads turned to see a group of riders emerging from the trees. Reverend Phillips, Mr. Collins from the school board, Dr. Morrison, and several other respected citizens of Willow Creek. At their head rode Mrs. Thornton, her austere figure straight-backed in the saddle. "Elizabeth," Hargrove acknowledged with visible surprise. "What are you doing here?" "Preventing a grave injustice," Mrs. Thornton replied crisply, guiding her horse forward. Her sharp eyes took in the scene. Eleanor standing beside Caleb, the sheriff with his rifle, Hargrove's men with their hands hovering near their weapons. When we heard what you were planning, she continued, the school board felt compelled to intervene. We will not have violence done in our community's name. Eleanor felt a surge of hope at this unexpected intervention, though she remained wary. Mrs. Thornton had been among her harshest critics at the confrontation in the schoolhouse. What happens up here is no concern of the school board, Hargrove growled. On the contrary, Mr. Collins spoke up. The welfare of our teacher is very much our concern, as is justice. Mrs. Thornton dismounted with surprising agility for a woman of her years, approaching the porch with measured steps. When she stood before them, Eleanor was startled to see something like remorse in the older woman's typically stern countenance. Miss Hayes, she began formally, the school board has reconsidered its position. While we still have concerns about appearances, we recognize that your dedication to education, to teaching anyone who wishes to learn, exemplifies the highest ideals of your profession. Eleanor could scarcely believe what she was hearing. Are you saying I'm not dismissed? You are not, Mrs. Thornton confirmed. Then with a glance toward Caleb, she added more quietly, I, of all people, should have shown more understanding. The cryptic statement hung in the air for a moment before Mrs. Thornton turned to face Hargrove and his men. This vendetta ends now, Jacob, she declared firmly. Mr. Wyatt has committed no crime. He has every right to live peacefully in these mountains, as he has done for 15 years. You don't know what he is, Hargrove protested, but with less conviction than before. The arrival of the town's most respected citizens had clearly thrown him off balance. I know exactly what he is, Mrs. Thornton replied, her voice gaining strength. He is the man who was falsely accused in Silverton all those years ago, the man who protected my niece Catherine's reputation at great cost to himself, the man who chose exile rather than bring shame to her name. A stunned silence fell over the clearing. Eleanor looked at Caleb, whose face registered shock at this unexpected revelation. Your niece? He managed finally. Mrs. Thornton nodded. Catherine wrote to me last month when she heard rumors of a mountain man matching your description. She has carried the guilt of her deception for 15 years, Mr. Wyatt, as have I, for believing the worst without question. The atmosphere had shifted palpably. Several of Hargrove's men were now looking uncomfortable, unwilling to meet Caleb's eyes. So you see, Jacob, Sheriff Taylor interjected, seizing the moment, there will be no running anyone off today. Now I suggest you and your men head back to town before I start considering charges for disturbing the peace. For a moment, it seemed Hargrove might resist. Then with a muttered curse, he yanked his horse's reins and turned away. One by one, his followers did the same until only Timothy remained, his young face conflicted as he looked between his retreating father and the group on the porch. Go on, son, Sheriff Taylor said, not unkindly, but remember what you've witnessed here today. There's a difference between following a man and following what's right. After the Hargroves had disappeared down the trail, an awkward silence descended on the clearing. The townspeople shifted uncomfortably, clearly uncertain how to proceed in this unprecedented situation. It was Caleb who broke the impasse, stepping forward with the quiet dignity that Eleanor had come to admire so deeply. Thank you, he said simply, addressing the group but looking particularly at Mrs. Thornton. Been a long time since anyone stood up for me. It was long overdue, Mrs. Thornton replied, a hint of emotion cracking her formal demeanor. I hope you can forgive those of us who judged without understanding. As the tension gradually eased, practical matters were discussed. When Eleanor would resume teaching, whether Caleb might consider visiting town more openly now that the truth was known, how best to address the lingering prejudices that wouldn't disappear overnight. Through it all, Eleanor remained at Caleb's side, their shoulders occasionally brushing in a way that did not go unnoticed by the observant Mrs. Thornton. When the townspeople finally departed, promising to send word when it was safe for Eleanor to return, she and Caleb stood alone on the porch, watching the last riders disappear among the trees. "What will you do now?" she asked, turning to look up at him. "Will you come down from your mountain more often?" He considered the question with his usual thoughtfulness. "Maybe," he said finally, "if I have reason to." Eleanor found herself holding her breath, knowing they stood at a crossroads as significant as the one they had faced when Hargrove's men arrived. "And would I," she began hesitantly, "would I be reason enough?" Caleb turned to her fully then, his blue eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her heart race. "You've been reason enough since the day you took my hand in town," he said, his voice low and certain. "Just never thought that I might choose you?" She finished for him. "That I might find more truth in your mountain solitude than in all my years of respectability in town?" Something like wonder crossed his weathered features. Slowly, with the same care he had shown when crafting her wooden box, he reached out and took her hand in his. "I've been alone for 15 years, he said softly, echoing the words he had spoken when they first met. "But I'm not alone anymore, am I?" Eleanor laced her fingers through his, feeling the strength and gentleness in his grasp, sensing the future opening before them. Uncertain, unconventional, but undeniably theirs. "No," she whispered. "Neither of us is alone anymore." And as the morning sun climbed higher over the mountains they both had come to love, Eleanor Hayes and Caleb Wyatt stood hand in hand, two solitary souls who had found in each other the courage to begin anew.